Problem, reaction, solution. The Hegelian dialectic. If you turn on the news, the politicians will have you believe that everything happens by chance, that a crisis occurs and the news is shocked by it, and the politicians are shocked by it, and the public reacts, and then boom, here it is. The politicians have a solution, and they're going to solve all of our problems. And all of this is by chance, of course. This is what they'll have you believe. In reality, in the game of world control, control over people, immense wealth and power are up for grabs. And because there's immense wealth and power, there are so many people scheming behind the scenes, attempting to drive the world in a direction that benefits themselves, their families, and whatever direction of the world they see to be fit. This is why, for 60 years, there's conferences such as the Bilderberg Conference, where elites from all over the world meet in secret, where the CEOs of news organizations attend these conferences, but the news organizations themselves don't report on them. And for 50 years, if they were asked about Bilderberg Conference and conferences of that ilk, they would tell you, no, that's a conspiracy theory. These things don't exist. Because the people in charge, the oligarchs, the people above the politicians that buy the politicians, the Rockefellers, they don't want you to know that there are conspiracies, that they're scheming behind the scenes to drive the world in a direction that they want the world to go in so that they can gain money and power. And what is power? Power is the ability to use force. Force, fraud, and coercion. Taxes are a great example. Because if you don't give, what is it now, 30, 40, 50% of what you bring in, of what you work, you put your blood, sweat, and tears into, if you don't give that to the government will show up with guns, and they will confiscate what's yours, and they will lock you in a jail cell, and they will take everything you have. Power. Why do I bring this up today? I came across a document. I'm going to read this here. United Nations document from 2000 exposes global migration replacement solution to developed world demographics. A document has surfaced from the year 2000 from the United Nations in which they identified, through demographic trends, because the fertility rates in the West have been going down so rapidly that the West has actually been depopulated over the last 50 years. Population growth has completely leveled out and is even declining in some Western areas. So these oligarchs, in order to set up a system of control, you know what, actually before I get into that, why have the fertility rates gone up? It's not by accident. The science hasn't gotten worse. The science has gotten better. But the politicians are bought off, and George Soros and Bill Gates invest tremendous amounts of money in biotech companies like Monsanto, who create GMO foods, who poison our food, who put fluoride in our water and poison our water, and they promote young girls to be on birth control. And they know that these birth control has side effects, and part of those side effects are leading to high infertility rates. They know that the vaccines lead to high infertility rates and infertility, including Gardasil, in many young girls, but they don't give warnings. You know, I'm all fine for something because I'm all about freedom if you're giving a warning, but they don't tell young people the potential side effects, that you might not be able to have children because of these things. So they depopulate us and they destroy our fertility, and then there becomes a problem because they realize that part of the oligarchical control is always promoting socialism. And they do this in a drip, drip, drip fashion. So they find a problem and They tell you this is a problem, and the example I'm going to use here is Social Security, that the elderly people are going to starve to death. So in order to fix that problem, what we have to do is we have to create Social Security. Force, fraud, and coercion. So now, we will take, through force, a percentage of your paycheck. And of course, over the years, that percentage goes up and up and up. And this is a good Ponzi scheme for the government, the oligarchs who control the government, because they've set up a banking system, the Federal Reserve System, that is managed through debt, right? We're not even on a gold standard. The dollar is completely based off the full faith of the federal government. And what that means is faith that they will use force, fraud, and coercion to tax the public and collect interest for the people that run the Federal Reserve Bank, which are the oligarchs. For those of you not aware, the Federal Reserve Bank was created in 1913. There was a secret meeting on Jackal Island between the biggest banks in the country at the time, the Rockefellers, JP Morgan, the Rothschilds, and they got together and they created a scheme to change the American banking system so that there would be a central bank, a monopoly over the creation of money, because if you could create money, you essentially become the government. And they used Nelson Aldrich, who married into the Rockefeller family, and he put through the Federal Reserve Act in 1913 and created the Federal Reserve System. And basically, the central banks print our money, and they loan it to the government at interest, and the government pays that money back. I'm getting a little off topic here, but I just wanted to, keep you updated to where I'm going. So now these oligarchs create a social security system, and they tell you that it's needed to protect you, because if not, you're going to starve to death when you're old. Great Ponzi scheme, because now they're collecting more taxes. It's leading to more printing of money. Everything's fantastic. And of course, they don't save that money. They don't put it in an account, not even in the stock market, let it grow and give it back to you. No. They spend that on whatever they want, and they say, we'll figure out how to pay for Social Security later. But they're running into a problem because they decided to depopulate us. So that's what this article is about. That in the year 2000, the United Nations, which is controlled by these very same oligarchs, Rothschild, Rockefeller, JP Morgan, these families that are larger than life, that control the Democratic Party, they control the Republican Party, not in that they dictate everything that happens, but they have enough financial control to always dictate the direction a country goes in. So they realize that the West is being depopulated. And now their systems, their socialist systems, like Social Security, that they were counting on, they're not sustainable. Because now where you used to have 60 young people for every 1 or 2 old people, whatever it might be, don't quote me on those numbers, now you have only a few young people for a lot of old people, so it's not sustainable anymore. So their plan now, and this is in the document, which I will attach in the reference notes, it's the Migration Replacement Solution Plan from the year 2000 by the United Nations, was to flood the West with third world populations. Well, are we seeing that right now? So what did we see? We saw in Western invasions of the Middle East in the year, I'm not even going to get into 9/11. You can have your own thoughts about that. In the year 2003, our government, the United States of America, sold the public that Iraq was somehow involved in 9/11, or tried to tie them to it when they had nothing to do with it. They told the public that there were weapons of mass destruction. And they got the public to go to war. Because when they get the public to go to war, you see, if you're waging aggressive wars, you have to always wage them to the public as these are defensive wars. That's why it's not called the Department of War, it's called the Department of Defense. Because you have to convince the public that these are defensive wars, because the public won't support aggressive wars. Because the public in our nature are, good people. We don't want to go to foreign countries and conquer them and kill people who, we've never met. Why would we want to do that? So in 2003, we go and we invade Iraq, and we invade Afghanistan, and all right, you could argue there was more legitimacy to that. And of course, then Obama runs for the White House, and hope and change, the peace president, he gets elected, and he gets a Nobel Peace Prize for getting elected. And then what does he do? He drops a bomb every 20 minutes. You could literally look this up. Every 20 minutes for 8 years, the Nobel Peace Prize president. Which is so funny when they say, Trump is so hateful of third world populations. He's so hateful of Muslims. Obama was so tolerant. He was tolerant by dropping bombs on them every 20 minutes for 8 years? This is what you call cognitive dissonance, doublethink, as George Orwell referred to it. So Obama gets elected, drops a bomb every 20 minutes for 8 years, and he supports the overthrowing of, first he supports the Arab Spring and the overthrow of the Egyptian government, and he supports a war in Yemen, and he supports the toppling of Assad in Syria, and we arm rebels in Syria. Something I'm very happy about, a policy that Donald Trump just ended, arming rebels in Syria. So basically we were arming ISIS because ISIS would fight Assad. That's American foreign policy for you. We'll tell the public we're fighting ISIS as we arm them. And then we financed and provided the weapons for the overthrow of Gaddafi in Libya. And what did this create? Problem, reaction, solution. This created a refugee crisis because our government was already well aware that the only thing that stopped African migrants from flowing into Europe was Gaddafi preventing it through Libya. So they overthrew Libya, and voila, refugee crisis. So then we have this refugee crisis, and now the politicians come along, and they say, you are heartless, you are soulless, unless you bring in all of these refugees. How can you leave these people? Are you a Christian? So, Europe brings in all of these refugees, and in America, Trump runs for office and says that we're not going to bring in these refugees because obviously then our socialist economy, it grows the socialist economy too, so it's a nice double-edged sword. America's economy, we can't afford to bring these people in, not because we're hateful, because if you bring in third world populations, the American economy, the American taxpayer has to pay for them because they're coming here they don't speak English, they can't get a job, and the American taxpayer has to pay for them. Not to mention that a large amount of them have been radicalized. Now, I would argue that a large amount of them have been radicalized because all they've seen for 20 years is American bombs dropping on them. But regardless of why they're radicalized, they have been radicalized, and they're also a security threat. But the politicians will go and they'll tell you you're hateful and you're heartless if you don't want this to happen. And I'll always be the first person to tell you, you never judge a book by its cover. I will never judge a person for being Muslim or subscribing to Islam or being black or Spanish. I think every person is an individual, and we have to keep the spirit of Martin Luther King. And that's why I don't say, oh, all Muslims are, evil people. It's ridiculous. There are radical Muslims. There are moderate Muslims. But the point is that they use problem, reaction, solution to try to guilt people in the West to thinking we have to bring in these populations at our own detriment. It's like suicide. So they create this refugee crisis, and then they flood the West with refugees. And then we see this report that in the year 2000, the United Nations they already started scheming, right? George Soros and Bill Gates and all these people that support the refugees started scheming for ways to try to flood the West with third world populations to keep up their socialist systems. And then they put this problem, reaction, solution, they do the solution, and they get what they want, and the public's completely unaware of it. They think these events are all at random. But the public fights back. So Trump gets elected in the United States, and he tries to put an end to these refugee crises. But there's judges that rule from the bench. And even though the law in the United States does dictate that the president has every right to limit immigration, they overrule President Trump and they let the migrants come in. All right, fine. It eventually goes to the Supreme Court. And what we knew would happen, because it wasn't like the 9th District in California, which is just very a politically driven bench. The Supreme Court is really ideologically split. It's 5-4. But 9-0, the Supreme Court votes that the president has the authority to limit immigration from other countries. And again, they said this was based on race and xenophobia. But in reality, it was an immigration ban from 6 countries when there are, I don't know the exact number, but there are Muslim Islamic populations in about 50 countries. So if it was a Muslim ban, an Islamic ban, then they would have done the ban from all of those countries. So, and don't get me wrong, I support Trump on some things and I'll bash him on things. He gave Saudi Arabia $110 million worth of weapons. Saudi Arabia is the largest funder of terrorism in the world. So, I mean, American foreign policy is just so messed up. And why does he do that? My guess is because Saudi Arabia, we're reliant on them because something called the petrodollar. So basically, the petrodollar is when America came off of the gold standard in the 1970s, they needed something to back up the value of our money. So they made a deal with Saudi Arabia that oil would only be purchased using the dollar. And that props up the value of the dollar. So this is why we always kowtow to Saudi Arabia, even though they were, if you look up the 28 pages and you subscribe to that, they were the driving force behind the attacks on 9/11. But don't tell the 9/11 families they'll ever get justice against Saudi Arabia because they control our financial system. So we sell them weapons and we let them bomb the World Trade Centers. So then you see what's going on in England. England, the people of England also pushed back. They voted for Brexit. And this was largely an attempt to save their culture, to save their economy. That they didn't want the country bombarded. It's not that they were bringing in people from the third world. Bombarded, overran with third world populations so that the economy can't sustain itself. People can never get ahead and become middle class. And of course, the natural threat of terrorism, because there is a radical sector of Islam. And they voted to keep their sovereignty against Brexit, to leave the EU. And what do we find out this week? That now the politicians are saying, yeah, we're going to need at least 5 to 7 years before we could do anything in terms of limiting immigration. We can't just do a change like that overnight. Now, they could decide overnight, seemingly overnight, at least they would tell the public, that, yeah, we're going to bring in hundreds of thousands, millions of refugees from the third world. But when the public votes to stop that, oh, well, now it's going to take 5 to 7 years for us to put a rein on that. This makes me think of a conversation I recently had with my father, not recently, about a month or two ago. And I was talking to him about draining the swamp and how I really hope that Trump prosecutes Hillary Clinton for the multitude of crimes she committed. Lying about the server, and especially Benghazi, and lying under oath about Benghazi, and looking those families in the eye, the mothers of the dead Marines, and telling them that this was a result of a protest against a spontaneous YouTube video. When her emails show that she was well aware that it was a terrorist attack from the start, because you don't bring rocket launchers to spontaneous protests. So I would really hope that Hillary would be prosecuted for that. And we'll see. And, he said to me, Brett, Tom, so there you go. It comes out. I operate under a pseudonym. This is why on the Silk Road I said I understand where DPR operates under a pseudonym. I'm a government-fearing person, and I do try to protect myself. Tom Anderson is actually, if you've ever watched the movie The Matrix, Neo, who is promoting a mass awakening, right? The Matrix is a metaphor for society. His government name, his Matrix name, was Tom Anderson, which is why Smith says, Mr. Anderson. There you go. So I took on the pseudonym Tom Anderson, my first name being Brett. Anyway, back to my point. So I was talking to my father, and he was saying, you know, it makes me nervous that you could just prosecute these politicians after they're out of office. And I was trying to explain to him that because they have power, with great power comes great responsibility. They should actually be held to a higher standard, not a lower standard. If you are going to take on power over people, the ability to use force, fraud, and coercion to control people, then you need to be held to a higher standard. Because if someone like Hillary Clinton is to get prosecuted, that sends a message to everyone that's in office that has power that the masses can rise up against you, that you can be held accountable for your crimes. And if they are afraid of the masses, if they are afraid of the people, this world will be a much better place, because right now these politicians aren't afraid of us. We're afraid of them. I'm afraid of them, that I have to operate under a pseudonym. Because I'm afraid they'll come for me. Because when I'm making reports on Seth Rich, when I'm doing reports on who killed Seth Rich, someone killed Seth Rich. And I'm exposing all this stuff, and I'm walking down the street, I'm looking over my shoulder. And I go out to get a drink, and I make sure I keep an eye on that drink, because I don't want someone to drop drugs in it. I don't want to get roofied. Because you just never know. And yeah, it's unlikely. And then I do reports on the Silk Road and Chuck Schumer and his political prisoner. And I do reports on the DNC fraud lawsuit and Debbie Wasserman Schultz and the people being murdered and threatened by the DNC, which is just remarkable that the mainstream media doesn't cover this stuff. Because if you watch my reports, I show you the documentation. I could literally prove it's happening, which is why I try to do... They take a lot of time and a lot of research, but it's why I try to do my reports where I literally show you the primary documents, because these things are happening. So we need to... The government needs to fear us. I shouldn't fear the government, which of course I do. You know, you see me. I do reports on Facebook spying on us. I tell you to... This is what I do. I have a little post-it right here. Watch this. When I'm not filming, my computer is covered, and that's to protect myself. Because the spy state, the NSA, they're watching our Samsung televisions, are literally recording our conversations, which is just ridiculous. It's ridiculous. And you see why it's a problem, because if there's someone like me who's trying to expose this corruption, I'm constantly exposed by this spy state. Which is why someone like Edward Snowden has to leave the country before he leaks the NSA documents. Which is why someone like Seth Rich gets murdered. Which is why someone like Michael Hastings drives his car at 150 miles per hour into a tree. The same week he contacted WikiLeaks and told his mother he had to be careful because he thinks people in the government were trying to kill him. And then we find out through leaks to WikiLeaks that, oh yes, the CIA does have a program where they are able to hack into cars and take over the cars and drive them into trees to assassinate, an assassination program. Simply amazing. So people don't see the big picture of why these things are important, why prosecuting Hillary Clinton is important, and why holding people accountable is important. And I try to do a lot about historical things. Later this week, I'm thinking about doing something on the Bolshevik Revolution. For those of you not aware, all right, the Bolshevik Revolution, right, communism, is sold as it was a rising up of the suppressed masses against the ruling elite, a grassroots movement. And it was designed to spread wealth to all of the people. Well, in reality, what it was a well-financed coup, financed by the same oligarchs who rule in the West, the Rockefellers, J.P. Morgan. They financed Trotsky. They sent him on a train to lead a revolution. And I could document this. I'm not just spewing you know what. I'm thinking about doing a report, and I'll literally show you the paper trail of how the Bolshevik Revolution was in fact pushed by the oligarchs in the West. And then the second myth, right, that it's about spreading wealth amongst the people. The same thing with socialism, social security. It's about spreading wealth and helping you, when in reality what it's about is about centralizing control of the means of production, giving the government, a very few people, a tremendous amount of power and wealth. And once they have that power and wealth, yeah, they'll spread the wealth, like every one of us is in poverty and could barely afford to eat. Not that there's a middle class. And these are the big lies. And so I try to use a lot of historical stuff, because if you could show how these things have happened historically, then you can show people how they're happening now. And that, again, it fits into problem, reaction, solution, right? That's how it was sold. Just like the migrant crisis, the refugee crisis was sold as problem, reaction, solution. And I try to be very careful with my language, as I have here, because I don't want you to think I'm trying to condemn Muslims or Islamic people. I know Muslim Islamic people who are fine. They're great people. Known them my whole life. But there's also large sects that are dangerous, and you have to be willing to call that out for what it is. And they have flooded us with these populations, and they just completely ignore the will of the masses. So when the masses vote to have the refugees cease to come into America or England, the ruling oligarchs just say, that's nice, voting, that's cute. You think you get your way. So we have to be made aware of this, and we have to hold politicians accountable. Anyway, I look forward to your comments. I covered a lot of topics here. I hope you share these links. I hope you tell people, I follow FFRnews, this guy Tom Anderson. Whether you agree with me or disagree, the important thing is that we have debates. The only thing I'm trying to do is promote liberty, so that we're all free and that we expose a lot of the corrupt things that the government does. So again, I look forward to your comments. Like and share these links. I'm Tom Anderson, FFR News.